It was a fortress that should have fallen in a week. Instead, it endured for 1,470 days. A tiny garrison of just over 7,000 British and Hanoverian troops stared down the combined might of France and Spain's 60,000-strong army. They were starved, abandoned, and hammered by the greatest artillery bombardment the world had ever seen. But they refused to break. This is the story of the fatal mistake made by two of the world's great empires, and the secret weapon, forged in the heart of a mountain, that turned a forgotten outpost into the eternal symbol of British defiance. Welcome to Indomitable history. The year was 1779. Great Britain was on its knees, locked in a desperate war across the Atlantic, fighting to keep its American colonies. The nation was isolated and vulnerable. Its ancient enemies, France and Spain, saw their chance. This was the moment to strike a final, humiliating blow, and they knew exactly where to aim their dagger. A tiny peninsula of limestone, less than 3 miles long, guarding the gateway between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. Gibraltar. Ceded to Britain 66 years earlier, the rock was a constant, infuriating reminder of Spanish defeat. For the Spanish king, Charles III, recapturing it was a national obsession. For the French, it was a chance to sever Britain's naval lifeline and cripple its empire. The plan was simple and brutal. They would surround the rock by land and by sea. They would cut off every shipment of food, every barrel of gunpowder, every letter from home. And then they would bombard the fortress into dust. On the 21st of June, 1779, the Great Siege began. The noose was drawn tight. Inside the fortress stood a man who knew only duty, the governor of Gibraltar, General George Augustus Eliott. He was 62 years old, a veteran of countless campaigns, a man who ate and drank as little as his common soldiers, and who demanded iron discipline from everyone. As the first Spanish cannonballs began to smash against his walls, he knew the odds were impossible. His 7,500 men were facing a force that would soon swell to over 60,000. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and utterly alone. The world expected him to surrender, but General Eliott had not come to Gibraltar to surrender. The first years of the siege were a slow descent into hell. The Franco-Spanish fleet formed an impenetrable wall of ships. Food became the most precious commodity on the rock. Rations were cut, then cut again. A loaf of bread, if it could be found, sold for a king's ransom. Soldiers and civilians alike were reduced to eating weeds that grew between the cracks in the rock. Leather was boiled down into a foul-tasting jelly. Scurvy, the ancient plague of sailors, swept through the garrison. Men's teeth fell out, their limbs swelled, and their bodies were covered in sores. The relentless Spanish bombardment became the soundtrack to their lives. Day after day, shells rained down, turning homes into rubble and fortifications into graveyards. The pressure to give up was immense, but in the face of starvation and death, the British bulldog spirit began to show its teeth. Governor Eliott was a master of defiance. He set a personal example, living on simple rations and sharing the hardships of his men. He knew that to simply sit and endure was to die slowly. They had to fight back. They had to remind the enemy that this rock had claws. On the night of the 26th of November, 1781, after more than 2 years under siege, Eliott gave the order. Under the cover of darkness, 2,200 British soldiers fixed their bayonets and slipped out of the fortress gates. This was the Great Sortie. They moved in complete silence, a tide of vengeful ghosts sweeping down upon the Spanish forward lines. The enemy was caught completely by surprise. The British stormed the trenches, spiked the cannons, and set fire to the vast stockpiles of ammunition and supplies the Spanish had spent months building up. The night sky erupted in a chain of massive explosions. Within a few hours, the work of an entire year had been turned to ash. The Great Sortie was a stunning success. It was a savage blow to Spanish morale and an electrifying message to the world. Gibraltar would not be starved into submission. It would have to be taken by force. Yet the garrison's greatest innovation was yet to come. The northern face of the rock, the sheer cliff facing the Spanish lines, was a tactical problem. It was a blind spot. The British guns on the heights could not be angled down far enough to hit the enemy trenches at its base. The Spanish knew this and were digging their lines ever closer. A solution was needed, and it came from a humble sergeant major of the Royal Artificers named Henry Ince. His idea was simple in concept but monumental in execution. If you cannot put a cannon on the mountain, put it inside the mountain. He proposed tunneling through the solid limestone rock of Gibraltar itself, carving out galleries from which cannons could fire down directly onto the enemy. It was a stroke of genius, a task that many believed was impossible. But with little more than sledgehammers, crowbars, and black powder, Ince and his men began their work. For months, they blasted and chipped their way into the heart of the rock, creating the first of what would become known as the Great Siege tunnels. It was grueling, dangerous work, but it would soon change the course of the siege. At the same time, another deadly innovation was being perfected. The British began building huge furnaces to heat cannonballs until they glowed cherry red. These were Britain's new superweapons, red-hot shot, designed to turn the wooden warships of the enemy into floating infernos. Starved, outnumbered, and besieged for 3 years, the garrison of Gibraltar was not just surviving, it was evolving. It was preparing for the final apocalyptic assault. The King of Spain was furious. The King of France was impatient. 3 years had passed, and the British flag still flew over Gibraltar. The greatest military minds of both nations were summoned to devise a final, overwhelming blow. The result was a weapon of terrifying power. They designed and built 10 floating batteries. These were not ordinary ships. They were colossal floating fortresses, their sides reinforced with feet of solid timber and cork, with intricate systems of water pumps to extinguish any fires. They were covered with wet hides to deflect cannonballs, and were considered to be both unsinkable and fireproof. Armed with 142 heavy cannons, they were the 18th century equivalent of a Death Star, designed for one purpose: to anchor beside Gibraltar and blast it into submission at point-blank range. On the morning of September the 13th, 1782, the grand assault began. The 10 floating batteries were towed into position. The bay filled with hundreds of support vessels carrying the elite of the French and Spanish armies, ready to storm the beaches once the walls were breached. A force of over 50,000 men stood ready. The bombardment they unleashed was beyond anything the world had ever seen. The Spanish land batteries, the French warships, and the 10 floating batteries all opened fire at once. The sky turned black with smoke, and the rock itself seemed to shake from the endless thunder of the cannons. The British gunners returned fire, but their cannonballs simply bounced off the thick hides of the floating batteries. For hours, the situation seemed hopeless. The enemy's superweapons appeared to be working perfectly. The British defences were beginning to crumble under the relentless onslaught. But Governor Eliott had been waiting for this moment. He had held his secret weapons in reserve. Now, he gave the order. From the newly carved galleries inside the rock, the British cannons roared to life, and from their barrels flew the red-hot shot. At first, it seemed to have little effect. The glowing cannonballs thudded into the sides of the floating batteries, sending up clouds of steam and smoke. But the British gunners were relentless, firing salvo after salvo with deadly accuracy. Then one of the Spanish commanders saw what he dreaded most: a wisp of smoke coming not from a cannon, but from deep within the wood of his ship. The red-hot shot had buried itself deep inside the timber, and the internal pumps could not reach the slow-burning fire. Slowly, then all at once, hell was unleashed. One by one, the supposedly fireproof batteries began to burn from the inside out. Panic spread among the crews. As the flames reached the powder magazines, the floating fortresses erupted in a series of catastrophic explosions that lit up the night sky. The grand assault had collapsed into a complete and utter humiliation. The invincible armada was now a fleet of blazing wrecks. The bay was filled with the screams of thousands of dying men. The siege was broken. The defeat of the grand assault was the final nail in the coffin for the Franco-Spanish effort. A few months later, in February 1783, the siege was formally lifted. After 3 years, 7 months, and 12 days, the defenders of Gibraltar had won. The news sent shockwaves across the world. Tiny, isolated Britain had not only held on, but had inflicted a devastating defeat on 2 of Europe's greatest powers. The consequences were immense. Britain's control of the Mediterranean was now absolute. Its global trade routes were secure. The victory at Gibraltar restored national pride at a time when it was desperately needed, and cemented the Royal Navy's path to dominance for the next century. The Great Siege transformed a simple fortress into a legend. It became the ultimate symbol of British endurance, tenacity, and the stubborn refusal to surrender. The phrase "solid as the Rock of Gibraltar" entered the English language as the ultimate expression of reliability and strength. Today, over 240 years later, the Union flag still flies over the rock. It remains a living piece of history, a British overseas territory, and a permanent testament to the courage of that small, forgotten garrison. The story of the Great Siege is a powerful reminder. It proves that a nation's strength is not always measured in the size of its armies or the wealth of its treasuries, but in the iron will of its people. It is a testament to the fact that when pushed to the absolute limit, the British spirit does not break. It endures. Thank you for joining us on Indomitable History. If this story of incredible British defiance inspired you, then be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next epic story. But now, we want to hear from you. What do you think is the greatest siege in all of military history? Let us know in the comments below.